September 1838. London is asleep. The city outside smells of coal smoke and horse dung and river mud, the particular perfume of a civilization absolutely certain of its own greatness. Gas lamps flicker on wet cobblestones. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell counts the hour. Inside a modest flat on Upper Gower Street, a 29-year-old man is sitting at a desk, and he has just written something that will end the world. Not with fire, not with armies, with a sentence. He reads it back to himself. Then again. The candle throws shadows across his face, long, strange shadows. And for a moment he just sits there, completely still, like a man who has accidentally walked into a room he was never supposed to enter. His name is Charles Darwin. And what he has just written, in a private notebook he calls B, is the first coherent sketch of a theory that will eventually dismantle 6,000 years of received wisdom about where human beings came from, why we exist, and what separates us from the animal. Staring back at us through the bars at the London Zoo. He knows exactly what he has. And here's what he does with it. He closes the notebook, slides it into a drawer, blows out the candle, and goes to bed. He will not publish this idea for another 21 years. Now, was he a coward? Was he a genius playing a longer game than anyone around him could see? Or was something else entirely going on inside that Victorian skull? Something far more human, far more fragile, and far more interesting than the marble statue version of Darwin that history handed us? That's what this story is actually about. To understand what Darwin was sitting on, and why sitting on it felt like holding a lit match in a room full of gunpowder, you need to understand what the world looked like in 1838. Not politically, theologically. Because in 1838, the question of where life came from wasn't a scientific question. It was a settled question. God made it. Genesis explained it. The Church of England didn't merely suggest this, it enforced it, socially, professionally, and in some cases legally. To question the divine creation of species wasn't edgy or controversial. It was career suicide. Possibly worse. The men Darwin called his closest friends, his intellectual inner circle, were almost all ordained Anglican clergymen who doubled as naturalists. Adam Sedgwick, John Stevens Henslow, the Reverend this, the Reverend that. These weren't just colleagues. They were the gatekeepers of scientific respectability in Britain, and their entire worldview rested on what was called natural theology, the idea that studying nature was, essentially, studying the handiwork of God. Darwin had been one of them. He'd studied for the clergy himself at Cambridge. He'd genuinely considered becoming a country parson, collecting beetles on weekdays, delivering sermons on Sundays, living a perfectly comfortable, perfectly unremarkable English life. Then came the Beagle. 5 years at sea. 5 years of watching finches in the Galapagos develop different beak shapes on different islands. 5 years of digging up fossils of creatures that no longer existed, creatures that looked almost like living species, but not quite. 5 years of a nagging, accumulating, increasingly impossible to ignore question. What if they changed? What if species weren't fixed, eternal creations dropped into the world fully formed by a divine hand, but instead were fluid, responding, adapting? What if the finches on one island had different beaks because different beaks worked better on that island, and the birds that happened to be born with the right beak survived long enough to have children, and those children inherited the beak, and over thousands of generations? He stopped himself. He knew where that sentence ended. It ended with God becoming optional. By 1838, Darwin is back in London. He's 29 years old, recently famous from his Beagle journals, welcomed into the best scientific societies, dining with the most respected minds in Britain. His career is ascending. His reputation is immaculate. And privately, in a series of notebooks he labels with letters A, B, C, D, he is quietly, methodically, building the bomb. He's reading everything. Geology, botany, animal breeding, and crucially, a little book by an economist named Thomas Malthus called an Essay on the Principle of Population. Malthus argued that populations always grow faster than food supplies, which means there's always more competition than resources, which means the ones best suited to compete will survive. The rest won't. Natural selection. There it is. The mechanism. The engine. The answer to the question he'd been circling for 3 years. He writes it out. He reads it back. He understands, with the particular cold clarity of a genuinely brilliant mind, that this idea, if true, and he is increasingly certain it is true, removes the need for a designer, for a creator, for God, in any theologically recognizable sense. And then he looks up from his desk and thinks about his life. His father, Robert Darwin, a wealthy, socially powerful physician, had warned him explicitly that radical ideas were the fastest way to destroy a respectable career. "You'll be associated with the wrong people," his father had said. The wrong people, in 1838 England, meant French materialists, revolutionaries, the intellectual descendants of the men who had guillotined the French aristocracy barely 50 years earlier. In the English imagination, radical science and radical politics were the same disease. And then there was Emma Wedgwood. Darwin was already planning to marry her. He would propose within months. She was intelligent, warm, genuinely wonderful by all accounts, and a sincere, devout Christian who would spend the next 40 years of her marriage quietly terrified that her husband's work was condemning his immortal soul. Darwin knew this. He knew it before he proposed. He married her anyway, and he loved her deeply, and the tension between those two facts, his love for her and his possession of an idea that contradicted everything she held sacred, sat in the middle of their marriage like an unexploded shell for the rest of their lives together. So, he waits. The years pass. The notebooks fill up. Darwin moves his family to Down House, a country estate in Kent, deliberately, strategically remote from London's social pressures and theological gossip. He writes papers on other things: coral reefs, volcanic islands. He spends 8 years, writing the most comprehensive scientific monograph ever produced on barnacles. 4 volumes. Every species of barnacle known to science, described in exhaustive detail. The scientific world is baffled. The man who sailed around the globe is writing about barnacles? But here's the thing nobody quite understood at the time. Darwin was building his credibility like a fortress. Every paper, every monograph, every letter to every respected naturalist was another brick in a wall he was constructing around himself, so that when the day finally came to drop the real idea, nobody could dismiss him as an amateur, an outsider, a crank. He was playing defense, and he was playing it brilliantly. But, and here's the part nobody talks about, in 1844, 15 years before he publishes a single word of his theory, Darwin writes a letter, not to a scientific journal, not to a colleague, to Emma. He instructs her that if he dies, suddenly, unexpectedly, before he has published his work, she is to take the manuscript from his desk, find a competent editor, and publish it. He sets aside £400 specifically for this purpose. He names potential editors in order of preference. He has written his own scientific will. Think about what that means. He isn't just aware that the idea is important. He is so convinced of its world-altering significance that he cannot bear the thought of it dying with him, even as he cannot bring himself to release it while he's alive. He is simultaneously certain that this idea must reach the world, and paralyzed by what reaching the world will cost him. The man who would eventually explain that only the fit survive spent 21 years not sure he could survive his own idea. That is not cowardice, exactly. It's something more complicated, more human, more recognizable, if you're honest with yourself, than we usually like to admit when we talk about great men and the great things they did. The clock that finally forced Darwin's hand wasn't wisdom or courage. It was a letter from a man named Alfred Russel Wallace. June 1858. Darwin is 49 years old, still unpublished, still refining, still waiting, when a thick envelope arrives from the Malay archipelago. Wallace, a younger naturalist working in Southeast Asia, has independently arrived at the exact same theory: natural selection, survival of the fittest. The whole architecture, assembled from different evidence, in a different jungle, by a different man. Wallace is writing to Darwin because he respects him. He wants Darwin's opinion before he publishes. Darwin later described this as one of the worst moments of his life. 21 years of careful, deliberate waiting. And now a stranger in Borneo is about to publish his idea first. He writes to his friend Charles Lyell in a panic, "All my originality will be smashed." Within months, Darwin and Wallace present their findings jointly to the Linnean Society of London, a compromise arranged by Darwin's friends to preserve his priority. And then Darwin, finally, with the particular urgency of a man who has just watched his own reflection walk past him in the street, sits down and writes. 14 months later, on November 24th, 1859, On the Origin of Species is published. The first edition sells out in a single day. The reaction was exactly what Darwin had spent 21 years dreading. Ferocious denunciation from the church. Social rupture. Old friends who stopped writing. The Bishop of Oxford famously asked Thomas Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, his public champion, whether he was descended from an ape on his grandfather's or grandmother's side. But here's the irony that history tends to paper over. It worked. Not immediately. Not without pain. But the theory survived, not because Darwin was reckless, but precisely because he was not. Because by the time Origin appeared, Darwin's credibility was unassailable. The barnacles, the coral, the decades of meticulous, boring, unimpeachable scientific work. He had built a career so solid that even his most furious critics couldn't dismiss him as a fraud or a crank. They had to engage with the argument. And the argument won. Emma Darwin outlived her husband by 7 years. She edited his letters. She protected his legacy. She never fully accepted his conclusions about God and creation. But she loved him, completely, and with open eyes, until the end. Darwin died in 1882, in the same down house he'd retreated to all those decades earlier. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, 20 feet from Isaac Newton. The Church of England, in one of history's more spectacular reversals, gave him a state funeral. The idea he'd hidden in a drawer in 1838 is now the organizing principle of all modern biology. There's something worth sitting with before you move on with your day. Darwin didn't wait because he was weak. He waited because he understood, with painful clarity, what it costs to be right before the world is ready to hear it. He understood that the truth, dropped too early, doesn't change minds, it just destroys careers. And so he did something that almost nobody in history has had the discipline to do. He held the most important idea of his century in his hands, and he chose the moment. The waiting wasn't the failure. The waiting was the strategy. The question is, and I'm genuinely asking, what idea do you have sitting in a drawer right now that you're not quite ready to show the world? If the story of the man who rewrote human history, and almost missed his chance to do it, is the kind of thing that keeps you up at night, the subscribe button is right there. No pressure. Darwin waited 21 years. You can take a second.